Hello YouTube, welcome back to Nutkin Farm. Winter 2023. Nice time of year if you're visiting the Northern Rivers, and not a bad time of year if you're a farmer either, because the grass stays down, everything looks pretty green. You can actually stop and spend some time looking at the trees instead of what's growing under them, and you can talk about harvesting. Now in this block, which is block 1, it's a mixture of all kinds of different varieties. I wish I knew what some of them were. Have a look at this fella. Great big tall tree, growing way up. Its leaves are well and truly longer than my hand. I think my agronomist thought this was a Beaumont or something, but I don't know, maybe one of my South African subscribers can correct me. It's got massive nuts, whatever they are, but they're not showing any signs of falling yet. And when you do have that mixed block, you have to more or less wait until most of them have dropped before it's efficient to come around and pick them up. And as we learned from the wet years, it's okay for the nuts to stay on the ground for a while. It's frowned on a little bit by the Australian Macadamia Society, and certainly some testing shows that the thicker shelled varieties can handle being on the ground a little bit better than the thinner ones. There was some testing done of the new Macadamia MCT1. I think it was done by Marquis in the Northern Rivers, and while it was a very high kernel recovery nut and had a lot of percentages of whole kernels, the reject level on one of their pickups was about 11%. Now, most processors would reject a shipment of 11% reject, but it was because insects and water and everything had got into the thin husk and shell of the nut. So while it's a very popular variety, there have been over 500,000 planted. Just a little warning that it's a nut that needs to be treated in a fairly Rolls-Royce fashion for you to get the best out of it. The good news is, of course, you can get very good results from it, and that's been proven over many years of testing. So anyway, I wish I knew again what some of these were. We still have a tiny bit of out-of-season flowering going on in the odd tree. I'll have to show you what Stupid's doing in a minute. Stupid's my tree that flowered fully in February, and you might be a bit surprised to see what's going on. Anyway, we have just, while it's cloudy, there's some black clouds around there. We actually had some rain yesterday. The macadamia growing districts in Australia have all had a bit less than average rain so far this year. Bundaberg has had, to the end of May, 368 millimetres against an average of 556. Alstonville's had 557 millimetres against an average of 771. Up here in Rosebank, we've had 783 millimetres against an average of 1,134. Have a look at this fella. This is an A4. Good big nuts, yet to drop though, but yeah, promising. Anyway, when you look at those rainfall figures, and well, particularly for Rosebank, you wouldn't be worried, but everyone's talking about an El Niño coming, and there needs to be an established pattern before they'll declare an El Niño. But it seems that the ocean temperatures in the Pacific are matching a pattern of that. Now, don't get fooled into thinking El Niño is El Niño. There's relative different strengths of them. So the one in 2019, which I can, I'm used to coming on here saying I have not enough experience to lecture you. In 2019, I came here during an El Niño, so I know what it's like. It was really dry, and 99% of New South Wales was drought declared. The 1% was here and up in the Northern Rivers. And it was very dry, but that was a very severe El Niño. The one previous to that in 2015 or 16 didn't affect the Northern Rivers so much. So there's a question of degree. You may be wondering, what about other countries in the world that grow macadamias? How does El Niño affect them? Because it doesn't always mean less rainfall for everyone. Some places in the world get more rainfall. But interestingly, with macadamias, just about every place in the world that grows them has less rain in an El Niño. So it can really affect South Africa badly. Guatemala, which is actually quite a large producing country. Hawaii, still there growing nuts. It gets less rainfall. Most of the areas of the world do actually get a lot less rain in El Nino. The one exception, funnily enough, is Kenya, which is now a very big producer. El Nino can bring more rain and flooding to Kenya, which is the last thing they want to hear after their flooding's already started, and they've had some big disasters there in parts of Kenya. I don't know whether that's the area where they grow macadamias, but they're sort of the odd one out in the macadamia growing world where you need a dry spring and a wet autumn. El Nino seems to pick on us particularly. Now here's stupid. Have a look at this. I thought all these baby nuts that it put on in February would be shed, but it's actually hung on to a fair few of them. It's got what would be an almost reasonable crop if it happened at the right time of year. Now, the nuts are still growing, obviously. They're not ready to drop anytime soon, and if they sort of stay all the way to full term, you might think, well, they could drop in winter possibly. But as a catch-up job, from flowers that happened in February, we're at the start of June here, and it's actually, not too bad. It'll probably miss harvest time, but I'll send some relatives or friends under the tree at some point, and we will eat the nuts of stupid. And I may eat my words as well. Anyway, so El Nino presents some challenges for farmers, but it's not as bad as we once thought. 2019 was a real test. It was apparently the driest season since 1946 up here in the Northern Rivers. And everyone was afraid that the trees would abort their nuts because there just wasn't enough moisture. There's certainly been some research on a lack of moisture in macadamias. Some university studies showed that there was less pollen tube development in the flowering, certainly less accumulation of oil in the baby nuts. So you had fewer nuts, smaller nuts, and obviously the tree stressed a bit in terms of general growth and health. That isn't exactly what happened. What happened in 2019-20 was that a lot of farms, a lot of trees under moisture stress produced a thinner shell and sacrificed shell in order to produce the kernel. And so you ended up getting higher kernel recovery. That is the ratio of shell to kernel. And that was really interesting because people had been predicting absolute doom and gloom. The trees stressed out to produce, in many cases, what was a better than average crop. And one of the reasons for that was that in a dry spring where you don't have any rain to ruin the flowers, a lot of flowers actually set nut and then sort of went on with it after that. So it wasn't the disaster year everyone thought. However, the delayed effect of El Nino was that in the following year, the 2020-21 season, the trees sometimes took a bit of a holiday recovering from the stress that they'd been under. And a lot of farms, including mine, had a pretty miserable crop that following year. This includes farms where they were well fertilised and everything as well. It's just that the trees put so much energy into producing that drought crop that they took a little break, a little bit of a breather. So that can be an effect of it. Which farms do well in El Nino? And ironically, it's often the farms in need of rehab with the closely covered over rows and the shade and no sunlight getting through to the ground. They often have a little bit better protection in a dry year than they do in a wet one because the soil doesn't dry out so much. There's less evaporation and the moisture that is in the soil hangs around longer and tends to be taken up more by the tree than by the sun. And so, and the lack of sunlight exposure that these trees have because, all the canopy's up at the top and they don't get side access to sun. There's less sunburn going on, and because there are more days of actual sunlight, the tree is actually better able to produce a crop from even a small exposure to sunlight relative to in a wet year. So for the bizarrely wrong reasons, an old grown over farm can actually be a little bit more resilient than blocks of trees that look like this, where you've got, ample exposure to sunlight on all sides of the tree and grass growing between the rows. Speaking of grass, there's a lot less mowing to do in an El Nino. I can say that from experience. I started in 2019 when I got Nutkin Farm, and I thought, this is easy. I don't have to mow. This grass stays down. And we all of a sudden got rain at Christmas time, and then I came back the next time, and there were about 3 feet of grass to mow. But yes, certainly mowing costs down. Pest costs as well are down, because in wet years they're usually regarded as high pest pressure years. Now, that simply means there's a lot of pests around. I should just say that. But yeah, in a dry year, insects, which, they're soft, moist animals like us, can suffer a lot from exposure to sun and not much moisture around. And so they don't survive as well. Also, when you're spraying products that have a residual effect by staying on the leaves, obviously there's no rain to wash them off. So the effectiveness of what you spray can be enhanced. And particularly where you don't think rain's coming, you can avoid the cost of what's called sticker oils, which are meant to make pesticides a little bit more rainproof, and that can be an expensive addition. So those are some input cost benefits of an El Nino. But what are the dangers that you might face? Well, baby trees is one of them. I jumped in spring 2019, and I just got in and planted a whole bunch of baby trees to fill in gaps in this block that were hanging around. And I think I might have planted about 32 trees. 30 of them died. It was absolute hell on baby trees, and unless you're here to hand water them, or if you're planting a paddock of them, mechanically water them, baby trees can die in a dry spring. This is one of the reasons why they say always plant in autumn, so the tree's root system can get established, and then if there's a dry period the next year, well, the tree's better able to survive it. It won't like it, but it can survive it. Maddie Kelby, who runs a great big baby macadamia plantation, got through the same El Nino that I did with very few losses of trees. His practice was to heavily mulch the base of the babies with the available grass, but he also brought in some mulch, plonked that around the base of the tree. I don't know if he was using water-saving crystals in the planting mix then, but he certainly does now. That's a way of holding moisture, and then eventually when it gets dry, those crystals release the moisture back into the soil, almost like a bit of a water bank, and that might have helped him as well. So it's no good for babies. For adults, well, if you're doing heavy rejuvenation work or pruning, bear in mind that if you expose trunks and other previously shaded parts of the tree to hot sustained sunlight, you can actually have sunburn of the trunk. You can ameliorate that by putting white acrylic paint on the trunk, although you might not necessarily feel like doing that. It's certainly a strange look where I've seen it before. The acrylic paint isn't poisonous or anything, but it's certainly not a natural way of farming. And in an El Nino, you're probably best not disturbing the tree too much when it's got its own sort of coping mechanisms, and the leaves at the top of the tree definitely provide some benefit in shading the lower leaves, and pruning them off could be a bad timing on exposure. So those are the considerations for an incoming El Nino. Some people say that, while the grass is still growing, let it grow. Obviously, you keep it down during a harvest. But longer grass, again, provides more shade to the soil, a little bit more of a barrier between the sunlight and the ground, probably reducing evaporation by at least a little bit. I see the sense in that point. And for those of you who irrigate, well, this could be your first year of not feeling stupid for a while, because in the recent years, you haven't needed irrigation, but in years like this, irrigated farms really come to the fore in that, you know, while you can't replace all the moisture a macadamia tree uses, you can use it to soften out the real shortages. You can also use it for feeding, and feeding is something that requires moisture. That is an issue for the rest of us, because when you put fertiliser down, it'll just sit there if there's no rain. And some fertilisers, particularly those that contain urea, can lose their nitrogen in evaporation, as in they'll be burned off by the sun, rather than get to the roots of your trees. So timing your fertiliser, if you're using granular chemical fertiliser, timing is everything. If you're using manure base, it doesn't tend to volatilize as much, and you're safer just leaving it on the ground and waiting for the proverbial rainy day. Now, hopefully it won't be a rainy day today, because I'm going to go do some slashing of the heavier blocks that aren't being harvested this year, and we can't do that in really wet grass, because that's just a recipe for overloading your machine. I'll leave you with a picture of this A4 here, and for some reason this season my A4s have done really quite well, with some decent nut starting to fall mid-season, which is exactly when it is supposed to do. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll be back again very soon, and hopefully have more to talk about. Bye.